Greetings, and on behalf of the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps and the Public Health Service D-Safe program, welcome to the D-Safe Infectious Disease webinar series. My name's Abby Lowe, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska Medical Center and the director of the PHS D-Safe program. In today's globalized society, infectious diseases pose a significant threat to the health and safety of the world's population. While we've dealt with many infectious diseases throughout history, emerging or re-emerging pathogens can spread at a much more rapid pace than in the past. The U.S. Public Health Service's role in healthcare delivery, research, regulation, and public health response makes them uniquely positioned to support outbreaks of any origin and makes the Public Health Service D-Safe Infectious Disease Series a key training opportunity for safety in any U.S. response. Today, we'll be looking at deliberate disease events and their relevance to public health service deployments. To do so, we're joined by two experts to provide us an overview and key site safety considerations for deliberate disease events. First, we have Lauren Sauer, an associate professor in the College of Public Health, Department of Environmental, Agricultural, and Occupational Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, and the associate director for research at UNMC's Global Center for Health Security. Lauren has been working in the field of disaster and public health emergency research and education for 2 decades and has deployed for over a dozen disaster and emergency responses. She's authored over 70 articles in the field of bioemergency and disaster preparedness and response, and has advised national governments, research and response networks, and nonprofit organizations on preparedness and response efforts. She will be giving us an overview of deliberate disease events. Welcome, Professor Sauer. Next, we have with us Commander Danielle Mills, who will ensure we understand the key site safety considerations for deliberate events during deployment. Commander Mills currently serves as the Incident Management Structure Safety Officer for CDC. She uses her experience in occupational safety and health management, healthcare administration, industrial hygiene, institutional safety, infection control, injury prevention, emergency response, informatics, and general environmental health skills to work with all CDC emergency responders and guides them to conduct their work safely by mitigating potential hazards. Previous experience includes Health Services Administration and 20 years in industrial hygiene, including chemical weapons elimination and decontamination, and 12 years in emergency management. Thank you for joining us today, Commander Mills. And at the end of the training, we'll have time for questions. So please use the QA feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen to submit your questions. Before we begin, though, I do have a few housekeeping items to run through, as well as an introduction of a special guest today on today's webinar. This is an accredited continuing education activity, and it's intended for U.S. Public Health Service officers. The University of Nebraska Medical Center is jointly accredited by the Accreditation Council for Continuing Medical Education, the Accreditation Council for Pharmacy Education, and the American Nurses Credentialing Center. As a jointly accredited provider, the University of Nebraska Medical Center ensures accuracy, balance, objectivity, independence, and scientific rigor in its educational activities, and is committed to protecting learners from promotion, marketing, and commercial bias. Here are our disclosures. And finally, how do you access your continuing medical education? Step 1, after the webinar, sign in to the UNMC MyCCE portal at the website you see there. Step 2, on your dashboard, click Evaluate Activity. And then step 3, use the code there on the screen to access your continuing medical education. And here's a quick reminder of the Public Health Service D-Safe training opportunities. You're currently attending the synchronous training, where you can learn about infection prevention and control on a range of infectious diseases and hear from experts on key site safety issues. Second, our asynchronous training is self-paced and offers training on infection prevention and control principles, and is also a prerequisite for the on-site course. And then finally, the on-site course is a 2-day hands-on training that's held in Omaha, Nebraska, where learners have the opportunity to practice key site safety considerations for quarantine and isolation, don, doff, and better understand the limitations of personal protective equipment, and have the opportunity to practice with hands-on simulation training tailored to deployed settings. And now I'd like to introduce Rear Admiral Guyton to give some opening comments. Rear Admiral Guyton is responsible for providing leadership and oversight of the development and implementation of officer recruitment, career management, including assignments, separations, and promotions and training services necessary to successfully manage over 6,000 active duty officers of the Commissioned Corps. Rear Admiral Guyton joined the U.S. Public Health Service Commissioned Corps in 2004 as a clinical staff pharmacist in White River, Arizona, and then transferred to Tucson in 2007 as the chief pharmacist. He was also chosen to deploy to Monrovia, Liberia in support of the NIH NIAID Prevail clinical trials as a clinical research pharmacy officer. Rear Admiral Guyton is the recipient of numerous awards, among them the Public Health Service Outstanding Service Medal and the Public Health Service Commendation Medals. Throughout his over 19-year Commissioned Corps career across 5 agencies and 4 duty stations, Rear Admiral Guyton has vehemently promoted the Commissioned Corps' mission to protect, promote, and advance the health and safety of the nation. He's committed to strengthening the Commissioned Corps as a national and global resource. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rear Admiral Guyton. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon to all of you. I really want to thank you, our partners for UNMC, for the great opportunities and the great subject matter experts you provided. Again, my name is Rear Admiral Cedric Guyton. I am here, the Deputy Director of Commissioned Corps Services. We are attending today, I think, the 11th one of our asynchronous training, synchronous training opportunities that we developed. The uniqueness of this program for all officers is that with our partner, we were able to work with University of Nebraska to develop a PHS specific type training modules that fit like a glove for our needs. Our needs were those found and determined during a lot of our deployments we had with COVID. The unique perspective of a partner that is as known as Nebraska, working with one of the great assets, which is the Public Health Service, is a monumental partnership that forever would change the Corps and how our officers are prepared. Nebraska, we want to thank you as Corps officers. During my time working with you all, going through our D-Safe training in person, I can tell you, you clearly increased our confidence of our officers to deploy. You've also increased the competency of all of our officers to deploy and understand their roles and their jobs, even when they're not deployed, with such activities as this asynchronous and now synchronous trainings as well. Also, the biggest point, you've increased the ability for us to collaboratively communicate in times of crisis, which is the monumental paramount thing that we as officers must understand, even in our clinical and non-clinical roles throughout. I wanted to make sure that there is the slide that shows the tangible numbers that show how many officers we've trained here. The intangibles are noted. Here are the tangibles. Thank you for providing the training and our officers for taking the opportunity during your busy schedules. You know, based upon many training modules, we understood that we may have asynchronous and we may have on-site training, but we wanted to make sure that we had the ability for you to interact as a group with our partner. Therefore, the monthly webinar. This is the 11th, and I hate to say it's the final for this year, but it's not the final for the relationship we developed with the University of Nebraska Medical Center. Training is the foundation by which the Corps continues to meet the needs of the nation and are ready to protect this nation. To our partners, to our great training team, Michael, Gay, Commander Albright, and our entire training branch have done the first time ever in the Corps' history a program that provides you with all 3 components of training because of their diligence. And also, I want to thank our pilot group that went out on a number of times to help develop the concepts, who work openly with the University of Nebraska Medical Center to ensure that the training modules, the experience were useful, on time, and provided real-time impact to you as officers. Again, training branch, great job well done. To our partners, University of Nebraska Medical Center, this has been one of the life-altering, career-changing opportunities that our officers have had. I really want to thank you for the continued support of the Corps. And again, I want to offer to our officers, continue to provide us with your feedback on the course. If you did not get a chance to attend in person, you'll miss one of the best trainings I've ever had in my 19 years. If you didn't get to put that papper on, we're going to get you next time. That will change your life and alter how you think deployments will really go. Being in that papper, trying to communicate with your team members is a life-changing thing. But to Miss Abigail and the team, we really appreciate it. And tell Doctor I apologize for spraying hand sanitizer in his eyes. I really enjoy myself in Nebraska. Thank you all and enjoy the training.
Thank you so much, Rear Admiral Guyton. I think I took the fall on the hand sanitizer in the eye for that one, but I'll pass your apologies on to him. And thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to be on this asynchronous or synchronous training. We really appreciate the engagement of the leadership at the Commission Corps, and as well the training branch leads that we've had the privilege to work alongside over this last year. I'm going to go ahead now and pass the torch over to Professor Lauren Sauer to get us started as we think about deliberate events and threats. So over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Abby, and thanks to all of you for having me here. I'm so honored to be doing the last one of the year. These have been incredible to be participating in, and the engagement from the officers has just been incredible. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We'll start this overview of deliberate events and threats. This is, every time I talk about deliberate events, I just think it becomes more and more important as to how we think about them, how we prepare for them, and how we respond to them. So today we're just going to really focus on the current approach to the management of deliberate events, primarily biological, but also we'll touch a little bit on chem and rad events. We'll identify response approaches that might be distinct from or impact the common outbreak setting, and review key site safety considerations for deployment. So there's different ways we can think about threats and their consequences, and this is just one way of sort of delineating those thoughts. We can think about threats as naturally occurring. So here we're talking about acts or threats that are naturally occurring, such as novel infectious diseases, a threat that's new to a region due to climate change or changing human-animal interface, or naturally occurring geologic or hydrometeorologic function that could potentially cause harm. Accidental threats are the unintentional release of hazardous, whether they're natural, adapted, or man-made substances. And those substances may inadvertently cause harm due to the release or due to the exposure. So these might include things like laboratory accidents, accidental release of chemicals or chemical spills, accidental release of biological agents, or radiologic materials being dispersed accidentally. And then finally, we'll think about deliberate events, which is the focus of today's webinar. So when we think about deliberate events, we're talking about acts or threats involving the intentional release of hazardous substance. So any of those substances we just talked about may cause harm, and we're thinking about them being used intentionally in that way. Hazardous substances may include chemicals, biological agents, and radiological materials. And today, as I mentioned, we'll primarily focus on the biological agents, but also touch a little bit on chem and rad. So there's two main, when we're thinking about chem bio events, there's two main entities that really govern the use of these weapons and the attempt to reduce the likelihood of the use of these types of weapons or these types of deliberate events. The first is the Biological Weapons Convention, which is international law that effectively prohibits the development, production, acquisition, transfer, stockpiling, and use of biological and toxic weapons. And so this convention or this law really focuses on the biological agents that we'll think about as potential threats. This was the first multilateral disarmament treaty banning an entire category of weapons of mass destruction, so all biological weapons. And it is signed by 185 member states across the UN and 4 signatory states as well. State parties to the Biological Weapons Convention. So those countries that have signed the Biological Weapons Convention have undertaken a never in any circumstances. They've agreed never in any circumstance to develop, produce, stockpile, or otherwise acquire or retain biological agents or microbial threats or toxins, whatever their origin, so however they were created or sustained, however they were produced, whatever type they are, and in whatever quantity, that have no justification for any other use besides potential weapons. So no potential prophylactic use, no potential protective use, or nothing that would be a peaceful application of those uses. And then weapons, equipment, or means of delivery designed to use such agents. So the tools that might potentially be used for dispersal, for hostile purposes or an armed conflict. So this Biological Weapons Convention really bans all of those potential uses, both the agents themselves and the tools potentially used to disperse them. The Chemical Weapons Convention is similar, and the goal of the Chemical Weapons Convention is to eliminate the entire category of chemical weapons of mass destruction by prohibiting their development, production, acquisition, stockpiling, retention, and transfer use of them by any state party, any signatory state. So this convention requires chemical disarmament rather than biological disarmament, as well as reducing or eliminating facilities which might produce them if they have no meaningful use outside of as a weapon of destruction. It also requires getting rid of any facilities or chemical materials that were once produced before signing the Chemical Weapons Convention and have been abandoned. Interestingly, this convention has a challenge inspection clause, which is an enforcement mechanism that allows any country in doubt of another country's compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention to request a surprise inspection with no right of refusal. So slightly different from the Biological Weapons Convention. And these two international tools are what we have to protect against chemical and biological threats. But as we know in today's world, they are not always perfectly applied, and non-state actors, individuals, and in some cases, country-level governments have used biological and chemical weapons. So today we'll focus on those deliberate threats of primarily biological and chemical in nature. And deliberate threats, as we talked about, these events cover a wide spectrum of intent, a wide spectrum of public health consequences, and can be incredibly challenging to plan for. The scope of deliberate events can range from small-scale events that affect a single individual to potentially global-scale man-made pandemics. The next speaker will get into a little more details around some examples of these types of events. Deliberate events can be disguised and used to lure responders to a scene or a response, and then those responders can be targeted. And so we'll talk about the potential for that to happen and what it means for you as an individual responder. So when we think about these events, one of the ways we can think about them in both preparedness and response phases is the area of impact that they might create. So in biological events, impacts can propagate from the original source through reinfection or vector spread, and they might not be detected until until the spread is well underway. And so it can oftentimes be challenging to determine the origin of a biological deliberate event until well after the initial consequences of that event have occurred. In chem and radiological events, the impact, at least in general, we primarily localize to the point of release. And that is because vector spread is not a meaningful spreading process for chem and radiological events. Propagation can occur through air, so particles can be carried through the wind, they can be carried through water, like, for example, hazardous materials put into bodies of water or reservoirs, or the built environment can be used to spread them. So materials could be deliberately spread through HVAC systems or recirculating air systems. In chem deliberate events, that area that we just talked about is usually defined and generally remains close to the source. So that initial point of distribution, there's a locus around it that really allows for a more controlled environment, generally speaking. Possible agents can be used that have industrial purposes, like the list here, and may have meaningful use in the real world, but can be used in deliberate events to purposely make people sick or cause injury and harm. Some of these may not have non-harming purposes. Some examples include organophosphates, irritants, asphyxiants such as carbon monoxide, choking agents such as hydrogen cyanide, vesicants or blistering agents such as mustard gas, and nerve agents such as sarin, VX, and Novichok. In a biological deliberate event, we see that impact propagating from the original source, and oftentimes the outbreak or the spread that it causes is detected well before the original source is understood. Oftentimes, biological events have ease of dissemination or transmittal from person to person, or animal to person, or other vectors to person, and can cause significant harm and spread relatively quickly before the propagation can be stopped. This may result in high mortality rates and have the potential for major public health impact, and has considerable impact on public health responders during the response event. The other thing that's unique to deliberate events is the public panic and social disruption. So accidental releases and naturally occurring events can cause public panic and social disruption. But when the origin of an event is not well understood or understood to be purposeful, that public panic and social disruption can be exacerbated. And it can be particularly harmful to public health and healthcare responders. Biological events require special action for public health preparedness, including enhanced PPE, improved laboratory testing, detection, and specimen collection for both healthcare, public health response, and for attribution further down the road. Some examples of agents that we think about when we think about deliberate biological events include anthrax, botulinum toxin, plague in its various forms, smallpox, tularemia, and myriad viral hemorrhagic fevers, including Ebola, Marburg, and Lassa. And as you can see from that list, many of these are naturally occurring. In fact, all of them are naturally occurring. And so understanding how they're occurring in a certain event and why you're seeing them, where you're seeing them, may help you to better understand whether it's a deliberate event or an accidental event, or a naturally occurring event. So why is this so important to us now? On the heels of the COVID-19 pandemic, where the entire public health infrastructure was put to respond, deliberate events continue to be a threat. So we already have a healthcare and public health workforce that has been so impacted by the pandemic, and is already sort of hamstrung by the number of people leaving the workforce and the challenges that they experience, and in many cases morbidity and mortality caused by the pandemic itself. And so a deliberate event could further exacerbate the challenges of the public health workforce. In 2022 alone, over 1,000 confirmed attacks on healthcare took place in emergency-affected countries and fragile settings. So where healthcare and public health used to be a protected entity in a response setting, it now has become a target. Public health is also no longer the trusted nonpartisan entity it once was pre-COVID, which creates challenging response environments, but also potential targets. And then finally, societal norms associated with nonproliferation and deliberate events are eroding globally. We have a lot of research that shows us that the societal norms that govern and protect us from these sorts of events are not as strong as they once were, and that the protections afforded to healthcare and public health workers are also not as strong as they once were. So this is just an adapted criteria for identifying potential deliberate events, the Grunau-Finke criteria. And I would encourage you to do a little more detailed reading if this is of interest. This criteria is strong for the process of identifying potential deliberate events, but also allows for flexibility in potentially not well understood threats. So the first is the existence of the biological risk or threat. Is the risk there to begin with? Are we seeing the biological agent? And then once we identify the agent itself, or even if the agent itself cannot be identified, the potential threat of the agent, we look for the special aspects of the event. For example, are there unusual types of spread or distribution of cases? Are you seeing cases in places that you previously have not seen them? Is the dynamics are the dynamics or is the intensity of the transmission, including what transmission modalities the agent is using, distinct or different or stronger than normal? Is the growth of the epidemic or outbreak unusual or unexpected? And so if you're seeing fast spread or spread in pinpointed areas rather than just growing from a single point of origin, that can be a clue. And then what does the clinical manifestation look like? Are we detecting an agent that the clinical manifestation looks stronger or different than it usually does when it presents clinically and naturally occurring cases? Additionally, you may detect high environmental concentrations of an agent or pathogen, which might be unusual in a normal, naturally occurring outbreak setting. And then you may detect limitations of impact to specific populations. So if we're seeing spread targeted at certain populations, that may tell us that this is purposeful or intentionally released in a way to cause harm to a specific subset of our population. We'll just talk here a little bit about the 3 different types of deliberate events and what their distribution of morbidity and mortality looks like. And then the next speaker will get into a little more detail around each of the types of events. But in a chemical event, you'll see a lot of morbidity and mortality right up front. And that is from direct and sudden exposure to the chem agent. You may start to see some lingering effects or lighter effects as the chemical is dispersed. And then you'll see maybe perhaps a decrease in mortality, but an increase in morbidity or an increase in exposures later into that timetable. But for the most part, both the morbidity and the mortality are going to be clustered in the earlier phase. When we're talking about a biological event, you'll start to see cases a little bit further out in that timeline. And then you may start to see people dying or having substantial morbidity associated with the disease. And then you'll see mixes of exposure, infection, and either recovery or death in repeated cycles, as to be expected. And that will change depending on the agent and the type of exposure that is being created. And then in radiological events, you'll see substantial morbidity and mortality up front, and in some cases, depending on the dispersal event, harm from that dispersal. And then you may see the longer term effects of the radiation exposure. One of the things we think about when we discuss deliberate events is the intent of the event and how we think about attribution. Attribution can be incredibly challenging, particularly in biological deliberate events. However, in some circumstances, we see immediate claims staked to an event, and attribution is claimed right away. In naturally occurring and accidental events that are relatively common, if a deliberate event is disguised to look like those types of events, it can be really challenging to understand attribution. And oftentimes deliberate events can be disguised as naturally occurring events purposefully so that the impact can be propagated for longer. Events originally labeled as incidental or accidental may actually be relabeled as deliberate once more evidence is collected and the event itself is more well understood based on data collected. Oftentimes, responders won't know they are managing the effects of a deliberate event right up front. This is particularly true in biological events. And so being aware of the fact that you may be operating in an event that has the potential to be a deliberate event is important. And oftentimes intel will help with that. Once a deliberate event is identified, the partners with whom you're collaborating with might look different. So there may be new or different partners supporting a response in a deliberate event versus an accidental or naturally occurring event. And this may include law enforcement type personnel, various hazardous material workers, and other groups or organizations whose focus is not on public health response, but rather on mitigation of the environmental impacts or the operational impacts of the deliberate event, and then possibly doing things like collecting specimens or materials for law enforcement and attribution purposes. This is the timeline from the Georgetown Deliberate Event Stakeholder Map. If you take a look at this map in more detail, you'll see all of the policy triggers that potentially can occur once a deliberate event happens. But I do like this slide as a timeline for understanding in a biological event when sort of outlined along the epi curve, you can see the timing of the various activities that happen in association with the event. So you'll start with case identification and then potentially agent identification. The humanitarian response to varying degrees, depending on the size and scope of the event, will set in. And it's not until after that response sets in, oftentimes, that the suspicion of deliberate use occurs. And then that triggers a series of additional requests for support beyond just a health and public health response. So the country or the locality where the event occurs may request additional assistance outside of the normal public health request pathways, including an investigative response. And so depending on the scale of that need, this may trigger large-scale emergency declarations or even localized emergency declarations. As you move into the response and recovery phase, the recovery from the event may occur well before or well after the conclusion of the investigation on the suspicion of deliberate use. But the confirmation can happen anytime, really, once that suspicion and initiation of the request for assistance occurs, but the determination of deliberate use or not will not change the pathway and the process for ongoing response and recovery. You can see that this is truly a sliding scale of scope and magnitude, but that there are triggers that happen depending on the scale and depending on the determination of deliberate use or not. This is just a simple table of the public health consequences that you may see as you respond to a deliberate event. And then when you're considering a chem or biohazard, if you're sort of thinking about them as either toxic agents or infectious agents, the likelihood of the consequences that you may see. So regardless of the type of agent, you are likely to see death, injuries, and illness. In chem and bio agents, loss of clean water, loss of shelter, loss of possessions, major population movement is unlikely in general. All the size and scope will obviously change the likelihood of these sort of spaces, but that protection of critical infrastructure at the from the local to the state to the country level will generally allow for populations to stay in place. This may change if a water source is contaminated with a CB hazard, but for the most part, the protection of the infrastructure still remains. Either way, you can see that the public concern for safety will remain high, and this is particularly true once it has been determined rather than considered that it is a deliberate event. Mental health issues, so the impacts of the event on people's mental health and levels of concern might change depending on whether it's a toxic agent that can be well controlled versus an infectious agent that can spread unrestricted once released. And then the impact to the healthcare system, if it is a controlled toxic agent where you can decontaminate and move on, those are really focal impacts, but with an infectious agent, depending on its infectivity and the mode of transmission, can truly be widespread. And then you can see in the last three, loss of power, toxic exposures, and food scarcity, it really depends on the agent, but all have the potential to impact the population depending on the scope of what is spread. So when we're thinking about a response to a deliberate event, public health can play many roles in a response, obviously. But here are a few focus areas that are essential for public health to be involved in. So the first is indicator-based surveillance, and here we're talking about conducting or supporting syndromic surveillance and case-based surveillance, and that could be in a clinical or sort of boots on the ground epidemiology approach, or in a laboratory setting. And so this could be focusing on case definitions and epidemiologic tracking, or it could be collecting specimens and supporting or facilitating testing in a laboratory and documenting cases. Event-based surveillance can include hazardous release information, so taking that tracking information and sharing it, security or law enforcement information, and open source intel. So that might include social media, traditional media, and rumors, and taking all of that information and aggregating it to a usable format to share with other public health agencies, with entities outside of public health, and with groups that might need that information for supporting the response to the deliberate event outside of just healthcare and public health. Public health can really provide key support in an event across the board, whether it's from those two areas of surveillance that we just discussed, or detection, so that early case identification, astute clinicians or astute public health practitioners or laboratorians, disease prevention, so early in the response, ensuring that messaging is appropriate, that quarantine and isolation occurs wherever possible, and that decontamination occurs to ensure that processes are used appropriately. Finally, public health surveillance public health practitioners can support risk communication, and this is absolutely essential to our ability to encourage the public to practice the activities that will keep them safe. So whether that is sheltering in place, or wearing PPE that's appropriate, or encouraging isolation and quarantine activities as they've been exposed or become ill. So just one critical public health lab partnership I wanted to mention in this space. It is absolutely essential for the detection and ongoing response to deliberate events, but also very important in naturally occurring or accidental event response as well, is the CDC Laboratory Response Network. And this in particular includes the LRN Bs and Cs, so bio and chem. It's a national network for responding to biological and chemical terrorism and other public health threats. And across the country, there are over 120 LRNBs and 54 LRNCs, and they continuously update their capabilities to ensure that they have the resources to respond to any 21st century threat. So when you're thinking about the specific considerations for yourself or your colleagues as responders in these types of events, here's just a few considerations that you need to think about. So especially if the deliberate event is known, can you safely provide response activities? So is the scene safe? This goes back to the basic elements of scene safety. Has the environment in which you'll be working been decontaminated, if that's appropriate? And can you enter into that environment with the appropriate level of PPE to keep yourself and your coworkers safe? Is there potential for secondary exposure? So even after primary decontamination, if that's appropriate, or in a deliberate biological event, is there the potential for secondary exposure in the space where you'll be working? And if there is, are you taking the necessary precautions to ensure or reduce the likelihood of exposure? Does the response environment contain evidence that may be needed by law enforcement or other response organizations? So this may not be known to you at the time, but making sure you're keeping open lines of communication with non-healthcare and public health response organizations, such as law enforcement, is essential to preserving any potential evidence that might be part of the scene. And then finally, unfortunately, we have to talk about this, but are you a target? You need to be vigilant. We do know that deliberate events can be used to lure responders to a specific scene, and then create a situation where the responders themselves are a target. So ensure that you understand to the best of your ability the safety of the scene, the protections that are afforded by you, and the likelihood of a potential secondary exposure. So when we think about CV deliberate events, some of the things just to remember are the routes of exposure. So contact, inhalation, ingestion, and traumatic wound entry are the primary routes of exposure for humans. And the health impacts. So we're thinking about outbreaks and epidemics, so exposure to pathogens, poisoning, burns, damaged immunity, damaged reproduction, cancer, especially in those later phases, body surface contamination, and traumatic injuries. And when some of these determinations, in particular the routes of exposure, will determine the types of PPE that is appropriate in the response. So if you're potentially exposed to a CB agent, the things that you need to do immediately are, first, evacuate the area and move upwind or to higher ground. Protect yourself from the elements and ongoing exposure, so ensuring that you reduce your risk as a responder. remove clothing, shoes, jewelry, and place in a sealed bag so that you can move through the decontamination process, and then decontaminate yourself carefully using soap and water shower or decontamination elements that are provided to you. And then finally seek medical treatment, which will be essential if you've had an exposure. If you're going to be working in a deliberate event, your PPE should be selected based on the type of event that you're going to be working in, or whether or not the risk is understood. So is it a novel pathogen? Do we understand the routes of exposure, or is it a chemical agent where we understand the decontamination procedure? So we think about the contaminant or the agent, the transmission modality and the physical state of the agent, how it's being dispersed or the dispersal modality, the respiratory needs, including the potential for the agent to create an oxygen deficient environment, and any information gaps that we have where we level up the type of PPE and the type of protection because we don't have full information. Risk assessments can assist with PPE determinations and infection prevention precaution needs and should be used whenever there is a lack of information. And then finally, in follow-up to an event response, the things that you need to do as an individual who worked in that response are to monitor your symptoms for post-exposure, including quarantining post-exposure if that's appropriate based on the agent, ensuring strict compliance with medical countermeasures. So if you're provided medical countermeasures, making sure you use them appropriately and adhere to their use for the entire duration. Seek appropriate follow-up care for both physical and mental health needs if needed, and then share pertinent health information like your exposure or medical countermeasures that you were provided with your occupational health office and your personal physician. These are just some additional resources, and I would encourage you to check them out. There's a lot of high-level material that can be really, really helpful as you think about and prepare for responding to deliberate events. And with that, I think I'll hand it back over to Dr. Lowe. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Sauer. And now we'll go ahead and I'll pass the mic on to Commander Mills to talk about site safety considerations.
Good afternoon. I am Danielle Mills, and we're going to talk about those site safety considerations. The key to prevention of deliberate disease events is to strengthen public health surveillance and response activities in order to be prepared for possible deliberate events. So in the deployment environment, that means before an attack, we should consider protective policies. So one example would be if your facility is receiving mail, letters from unknown sources should be screened by security personnel. If circumstances dictate, plan and prepare a chemical biological safe haven in your facility. You're going to want to familiarize yourself and the staff in advance with established emergency procedures and equipment at your post. For international locations, you can see your regional or post security officer for details. And remember, if in any case of suspected exposure to chemical or biological agents, no matter what the origin, medical assistance should be sought as soon as possible, even if there are no symptoms immediately evident. Fortunately for us, most of these examples are somewhat dated. The first 3 case studies were deliberately caused bioterrorism events that occurred in the United States. These events were not recognized immediately as intentional. In the anthrax mailings of 2001, the agent was recognized as intentionally spread within days to weeks, and that was a dramatic improvement over the 1984 salmonellosis outbreak in Oregon, which was not recognized as bioterrorism for over a year. The next couple events are chemical incidents relating to civilian populations not aware that they were at risk of being exposed to a chemical agent. Of course, deliberate chemical releases have been documented during wars, such as the Iran and Iraq War and the World Wars I and II. However, the 1998 attack in Kurdistan is thought to be the worst terrorist attack on civil populations. Reports suggest that 20 or more chemical or cluster bombs were dropped over Halabja, resulting in immediate death of approximately 5,000 civilians and subsequent injury of thousands more. And finally, you may have heard the term Havana syndrome, used to describe a cluster of symptoms experienced mostly abroad by U.S. government officials and military personnel. We'll touch on that specifically later on in the presentation. I would encourage you, if you're interested, to read these case studies, and I have provided some links at the resources at the end of the presentation. This is a reference to the Department of Homeland Security National Campaign. No presentation would about deliberate disease events would be complete without a discussion about the importance of reporting your concerns to local authorities to help thwart nefarious activities. And remember, your job is to report, not to apprehend. So I'm only mentioning this because, say, in the context of a temporary treatment facility like an FMS or shelter, congregate setting, something similar to what you might experience during a deployment, if something doesn't feel right, it should be reported. Do not be the hero and try to diffuse the situation yourself. But you also don't want to overlook something and brush it off if it's important. So as kind of previously mentioned, you should be in tune with your own body. On the next slide, there are some symptoms associated with anomalous health incidents that have been reported and experienced in the past. As mentioned previously, you may have heard the term Havana syndrome, and these syndromes were first experienced and reported by U.S. government personnel stationed in Havana, Cuba. So I want to stress here that while uncommon, it is important to recognize the symptoms of unexplained health incidents should be reported. If you notice something like this and it's out of your norm, it's important to report and seek follow-on care. So in order to report, you need to know how to report. What are reported as anomalous health incidents, or AHIs, may include several different conditions with different causes. Analysis of these events are ongoing, and even if not an AHI, it's important to acknowledge that individuals are experiencing something real, and the occurrence of symptoms could signal important health event necessitating healthcare assessment and intervention. An incident may not be apparent, but there might be clues. While not obvious signs, the next slide lists some of the clues according to the U.S. Department of State. Some indicators are listed here, and they fall in line with the spirit of the See Something, Say Something campaign. I'm going to pull your attention to signs of chemical activity like unusual drops on surfaces, or the classic chlorine cloud with characteristic greenish or yellowish color, or even unusual odors that seem out of place. Signs of victims could include dead or dying animals in the area, or groups of people displaying the same symptoms that seem out of place. As previously mentioned, in conjunction with the Havana syndrome, you need to be in tune with your own body and your own symptoms. There are many different agents that could be used in a deliberate disease event, and they might not easily be apparent. Generally speaking, chemical agents may produce symptoms more suddenly, whereas biological agents may take more time. Good personal hygiene and habits to include laundering uniforms and frequent hand washing and not touching your face is still a good strategy to prevent exposure to almost any illness that you could encounter on deployment and anywhere. However, in a discussion of deliberate disease events, we should talk about decontamination. It is of the utmost importance, especially once the deliberate act is apparent. Decontamination applies to chemicals and biologicals, but first and foremost, you will need to prevent ongoing exposure. So for our purposes here, we're going to focus on emergency gross decontamination. That's the physical removing of the agent. This is a quick method of decon. However, it's easy to cross-contaminate in the process. And this method does not necessarily include containing runoff, which also could be hazardous. It is an emergency life-saving measure. If containment is recommended and established based on the agent, be sure to follow that guidance. So once you get away from the area or the chemical release, you should get any chemical or agent that you came in contact off your body as soon as you can. So don't worry about what type of chemical it is, focus on getting it off. If you swallowed any of the chemical, do not make yourself throw up, and do not drink anything else unless instructed to by medical or emergency response personnel. To prevent health effects, it's important to get the chemical off your body as soon as possible, ideally within 10 minutes by taking off your clothes and showering. So to prevent getting sick, you need to prevent the chemical or biological agent from getting into your body. Protecting your airway and mucous membranes is paramount. If evacuation isn't possible, the best strategy may be to shelter in place. And this is what aims to prevent the chemical or biological agent from getting to you. It involves closing and sealing the doors and windows and turning off the HVAC to keep a barrier between you and the agent while it dissipates to safe levels and gives authorities time to respond. So also recognizing that actions to keep us safe may be dependent upon the agent or the threat, this slide provides some general steps to mitigate any exposure. If there is identification of the agent, you're going to want to adhere to that specific guidance. On another note worth mentioning is if a PHS officer experiences a bioterrorism or a biocrime incident, then you need to remember that they're a victim of a crime. Therefore, they may have items, even contaminated items, that may be of interest to law enforcement as part of their investigation. Before discarding anything, you should check with relevant authorities. We don't want to mess up evidence at a crime scene. And I've included some crime epi resources at the end of the presentation. Again, because some deliberate disease events are intended to be covert, it may be possible to overlook even the classic telltale signs. An example, which actually comes from a non-intentional event, has to do with timing. The yellow to greenish colored cloud chlorine is known for was not visible, or at least it was unnoticed in 2005 non-intentional train derailment and subsequent 90 tons of chlorine gas released that occurred in Graniteville, South Carolina. The wreck and release reportedly happened in the dark hours of the morning between 2 and 3 a.m., and the classic chlorine cloud would have been hard to notice at that time. So I really only need to point back to the first two biologic attacks from my example slide in the case of salmonellosis in Oregon in 1984 and shigellosis in Texas in 1996. Neither event was actually recognized as a bioterrorism event for over a year. So all that being said, let's go over the basic decontamination that you'll need to know if you're involved in an incident and you happen to be close enough or have been contaminated by dust, spray, or splash. So first, blot, do not rub your skin, face, hands, and hair with a moist wipe, wet cloth, or damp paper towel to remove any chemical. 2, take off as many clothes as you can, even if it's only down to your underwear. Taking off your clothes removes about 80 to 90% of the chemical. 3, cut off clothing if it has to be taken off over your head. If you cannot cut clothing off, hold your breath and close your eyes and pull it over your head so that you don't get the chemical in your eyes or nose or mouth, or can minimize as much as possible. Put clothes in a plastic bag and close it up, and then put it in a second plastic bag. If you wear contact lenses, you're going to want to take them out with clean hands and put them in the bag too. Wash your hair, face, hands, and skin, and wash from head to feet with lukewarm water and mild soap, if available, for at least 2 to 3 minutes. Try not to let the water run into your eyes, your nose, your mouth, and repeat, do not scrub. Flush your eyes for 10 to 15 minutes with lukewarm water if your eyes feel like they're burning or you can't see normally, and don't use eye drops. Do not drink fluids and do not make yourself throw up if you swallowed any of the chemical unless you have been instructed to do so. Dry your hair, face, and hands and skin to remove any remaining chemical. Use anything that'll soak up water, and then put the used things in the plastic bag and close it up and place it in the second bag and close that up too. Dress in any available clean clothes and try not to touch anything that you think might be contaminated. Put on a mask and gloves and repeat steps 1 through 10 for others if there are others in the area. Get help by calling the Poison Control Center at 800-222-1222 or calling 911 or going to the nearest hospital. So steps 12 through 13 and 14 involve how you're going to handle those materials. So you're going to wear gloves and put in plastic bags in closed container where they're unlikely to be opened on accident to prevent others from coming in contact with any kind of chemical or hazardous material that you can. If you don't have gloves, you can use plastic bags to cover your hands, but don't put those bags in the regular trash. You're going to want to listen to the radio or the television or check your phone and mobile news apps for updates from police, fire, or local officials for instructions on what to do with your contaminated things. On this slide, I've included some seemingly small things to do that can help you be ready and stay safe during a deployment. And here are some references and recommended training courses. And I'll pause just a minute so you can take those in. And here are some additional resources and information on the topic of deliberate disease events, and I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Commander Mills. And I think we have time for maybe one question. I do want to point to that in the chat, there's been some excellent back and forth going on, a question about mental health resources, and then some additional guidance given there too. Oh, go ahead, Mr. Gay, would you like to say something?
Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to thank everybody for their attendance and participation at all modalities of PHS DSafe. I do want to remind everybody, per a message that went out a few weeks back, those seeking to request CUs for this webinar and for the online training must complete the online training and the request for CUs by midnight or 11:59 Eastern Daylight Time tomorrow, the 15th of September. That's all I wanted to add, and thank everybody for their participation. Thank you.
That's great. And I see that there's still one question in the chat, and I might just open it up and see if Lauren or Commander Mills have something to add here. But the question is, what kind of site safety considerations would be employed during a deliberate event where large groups of people may have had exposure to a toxin or chemical agent and the contact is a major concern?
I think one thing that I would mention in this consideration is careful zoning. So making sure that you understand clean and dirty areas as quickly as possible and setting up the process so that people can move from dirty to clean or from dirty to warm to clean in a very clear and efficient manner so that you reduce the risk of recontamination as you're cleaning both your team and the area that's been contaminated.
Great, thank you. Anything to add, Commander Mills?
I don't. Dr. Sauer handled that very beautifully. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Well, I know we're at the top of the hour now. So again, thank you to everyone for your participation and engagement on the webinar series. And thank you to Professor Sauer and Commander Mills for your expertise on this topic area. And with that, we'll go ahead and close out our webinar for today. Thank you.